platforms, educational platforms for children.
I'm Elliot Soloway, University of Michigan. I work for her.
My name is François. I'm a game designer, similar story to Chris. And I have a small company called UdoLab. We do educational video games.
I'm Matt Farber. I'm an assistant professor in the University of Northern Colorado, and I play games.
You do it.
I do. I'm doing it. It's here. It's happening.
And he writes books about that stuff, too.
Hi, I'm Sabina. I have a company called Calistro, and we've been creating games mapped to the Indian curriculum for the past 7 years.
Okay, so that's who we are. Let's go on to the next section here. And, oh yeah, can we start the clock rolling? So, because otherwise we'll be talking until the sun goes down and comes up again. All right, so there's this basic premise really underlying almost this whole conference, which is why are games in education? Like, why are we even having this conversation? And so Elliot and Kathy have a few slides to start the conversation going on that.
Whoop. We just did this. Except that the title of what we're going to talk about is the digital transformation of K-12. Digital transformation is ongoing. Right? Every single industry is going through digital transformation. Apple came out with iTunes, and you could buy a music track for 99 cents. It killed the CD industry. They were gone. And they were making so much money, they didn't see that Spotify said, why should you buy and download this thing? We're just going to stream it. And so Spotify did to Apple what Apple did to CDs. So, right, I mean, and it's this notion of transformation, of major transformation. And what we're talking about on this panel is, in fact, a major transformation of K-12. Now, take a look at this picture. Take a good look. Would you put your child in this school? This school has those children sitting in those booths, those cubicles, 2/3 of the school day. There are 250 children in the room, 4 teachers. The delivery of the curriculum, the mastery, I mean, they talk like this, is that. It used to be that the scores, test scores would go up. But after a few years, they're finding that the kids, they don't want to be there. The test scores are not going up. They call it personalized learning. We call it personalized instruction. It's not personalized learning. That's why we need what this panel is about.
Exactly, and if anyone needed STEM or SEL, it is the students in those cubicles. What you're seeing now is one of the games that is most often played in schools in the U.S., and it's called Kahoot. Oh, and you know Kahoot. Exactly. So Kahoot is nothing but a Jeopardy-like game. And why do they use that? Is it STEM? Is it SEL? No. It is neither. It is used to occupy time because students have technology in the schools, and many of the teachers do not know how to use it well, so they allow the children to play Kahoot. We ask a teacher, how many hours a day can you play Kahoot? And the response was, 8. That's a little frightening. This is the whole point. In 2006, that's the date, Elliot and I gave a talk on this very topic. At the time, teachers were being told to integrate technology into their curriculum. And what we found from being in the schools is that schools don't want technology. They want curriculum that has technology embedded in it. So it is not their responsibility to try and figure out how to use the technology. And now what we need more than ever is curriculum that has not only technology embedded, but SEL and STEM. That's the only way that the SEL will get into the mainstream school, is to have it as part of the curriculum that is given to the teachers.
So hold us to that accountable. That how are we going to integrate all those STEM, SEL, and technology and provide curriculum to you, the teachers? If we don't do it, you're not going to use it. Thank you. Woo!
I love a call to action like that. That's right. So that's really kind of the underlying principle of this entire conference. Very nicely summed up. Okay, so we're accepting that we should have technology as part of curriculum. And technology is a really big term. Specifically what we're talking about in here is games, and games as filtered in terms of STEM and social emotional learning. And so what is that? What are those words? These are a bunch of, it's kind of an alphabet soup. So let's talk about what that is. And I believe Matt's got a few slides now. They're going to... No? What's the next slide here? Matt's got a few slides here. Am I in the wrong spot, Matt? Did you want to not use this to talk about STEM and SEL?
Sure.
Because it felt like this is where it should go.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's like my birthday twice a year. Thank you. All right, so I have a few slides here. I'm really seeing this microphone's quite loud. Okay, so there are many different definitions of technology and what we mean by technology. And I mean, this isn't a workshop, but with my students, I have them define technology in my teacher education courses. And one of my favorite definitions of technology comes from Steve Jobs. There's a short video clip. It's actually defining computers, and he defines computers as a bicycle for the mind. So it really enables people to do things that they may not be able to do in other ways, but it doesn't mean that's always the answer. So anyway, as you could see by this not so subtle plug of my writings here, or my Twitter account, this is my background. I study the intersection of really good teaching and really good games. And I've been hearing a lot about games here at the tech conference. And I should say games are quite nuanced media. We don't talk about film the same way we talk about games. Avengers of Infinity War and a Bollywood film and a Pixar cartoon and classic cinema, those are all films, but we don't just say movies can do this, right? Games are also quite nuanced, so we'll explore that a little bit as well. Does this thing work? Yeah. Is this thing on? To the right? Okay. Whoops. Oh, stage left? Okay. Anyway, I've been doing some work also writing and exploring these notions here. This is a paper I co-authored with Karen Schreier, and we're still doing some work on empathy and digital games. And a few things on this. Really good digital games have player agency. And player agency, because you can control the experience, can lead to a specific array of emotions that you don't seem to get in other forms of media. For example, in film and television, we maintain a parasocial connection with the on-screen character. We may root for them, cheer them on, feel for them, because empathy is feeling how someone else feels. In other media, such as literary fiction, there's research on theory of mind, how you can hear the monologue of the author, the narrator, and that does imbue some amount of empathy on readers. In video games, you control the experience. So that sense of agency can lead to different emotions such as guilt, pride, shame. You don't get a feeling of guilt by watching somebody on TV do something that is morally wrong. Where in games, because you are making those actions, you do have that emotion. And in literature, feelings of guilt may lead to empathy or being empathetic. This is the CASEL framework. If you look on casel.org, this is the CASEL framework of social emotional learning, which is what we're talking about, just kind of to frame things. Empathy and perspective taking fall under social awareness, but because this talk is on social emotional learning in general, we can really say that there are lots of aspects of the CASEL framework that we can apply. For example, responsible decision making, critical thinking, ethics. What good is empathy without action? What good is empathy without compassion? Empathy could actually, in some literature, empathy can cause you to do morally questionable things. There was a study reported by Bloom in 2017 about a fictional list of organ donors, and people were given backstories about some of the people on the list, and they were moving people up on the list. You could have empathy for a villain, right? So we want to look more beyond empathy. We want to look as well as what happens next. What are those dispositions? In fact, Karen and I are conducting a meta-analysis of the word empathy and the word game in major databases, which is to be submitted soon. Anyway, we have cognitive empathy and affective empathy. And empathy really involves a couple of things in psychology literature. I'm not a psychologist, just saying. But it involves episodic thinking and imagination. So when you play a video game or you're in VR and you're all of a sudden in a refugee camp, that does not mean that you have empathy because you're taking on that role. Empathy is feeling how somebody else feels. In video games, you may have empathy for the non-playable character that goes with you on this journey, the AI on the screen, and if that AI sacrifices something for you and dies in the game so you can proceed in your journey, you might have more empathy for that character. Cognitive empathy and affective empathy, which is thinking about empathy cognitively, and your emotional empathy, they are difficult to disentangle, which is also a quote from literature. And there are also different types of empathy. This is also used too broadly. Historical empathy, feeling how people felt in the past, that's not the same as, I designed this clicker, so I want to think about the end user's empathy experience, right? That's different than cultural empathy or global empathy. So we have to be careful of broad strokes with games as well as what empathy is. So with that in mind, I look at something called contextual transposition. In my study of teachers, I'm studying the global Minecraft mentor community currently, as well as teachers that use games really well. And I find they're quite similar to jazz musicians. They're a little, they mastered scales, they mastered a bit of the music, and now they want to, they want to improvise, right? Those are the teachers that tend to use games and more open-ended projects in classrooms. That's where contextual transposition, it's a term from Dr. Chris Haskell, comes from. Here's an example. This is Kerbal Space Program. And actually, if you go to the, I don't work for Teacher Gaming, but they have it on the Teacher Gaming platform out in the hall there. So it's a rocket kit. It's for STEM learning. You build a rocket kit, and you got to get these little Kerbals into space. That's the goal of the game, right? But what happens when you get this game in the hands of a really good teacher like Chris Haskell is this. He takes a screen and puts it in the middle of the classroom. Then half the class plays as the United States and the other class plays as the Soviet Union. Students are given different roles, like the rocket launcher, the media, spies, the government, and they have to see who can get the rocket to the moon in the first place. So they're developing a sense of historical empathy. Remember, it's not just all the same empathy, right? Historical empathy through using a STEM video game. And my last slide here is a viral article I've been reading about on my social media bubble. And this is super important. We need kids to play more games. And we also need to be careful about loaded words, like games. If I say, how many of you play games? By show of hands. Okay, so if your hands aren't up, you still play games. I bet if I confiscated your phones, I would see games on those phones. You know who you are, right? But self-identifying is a game. Gamer, writer, science, STEM, coding, those are loaded words. But we need to encourage more children to play games. If we want more girls in STEM fields, this is literature from 3 weeks ago about girls, this is from the University of Surrey in the UK, that girls who play video games are 3 times more likely to study STEM.
Thanks, Matt.
Mic drop?
Okay. Thank you. So that, Matt really covered a lot of sort of examples of certainly the social emotional learning, like what is empathy. I think we all have a pretty good sense of what social is. What I'd like to do now is open it up to a discussion with the panel, so grab a microphone. The questions that we want to discuss are like further thoughts on what is STEM and what is SEL, and how are they different from each other? Yeah.
I can certainly talk about the way that my company and myself define STEM games, right? So I'm definitely not on the SEL side of things. I'm more on the STEM side of things, especially the M part of STEM, so mathematics. Yeah, myself I am. So the way that my company personally tries to create games about a particular subject, right, is to include the subject you want to learn within the game's rules. So what I mean by game rules, I mean in Super Mario, for example. How many here played Super Mario or know that game pretty? Okay, I just wanted to make sure. So in that game, the rules of the game are about jumping and at some point growing, and then when you're big, you can destroy bricks. Right? There's a bunch of rules in that game that you learn just by playing. Right? And so I think Super Mario is a perfect example of an educational game about the rules of Super Mario, right? And so what we're trying to do is educational game about the rules of, in our case, fractions. So what do we mean a fraction, right? A fraction is a portion of a block, and so in the game you slice blocks. And so that's really the way that we construct these games, is really through the game mechanics you learn something without having text kind of explaining what's going on or anything like that. And so the reason I say this is because I think that might be an insight into how we could mix STEM and SEL games, but I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah. So I think that really helps define the category of STEM, is that these games are very focused, where the core mechanic requires the student to use science or technology or math. I don't remember what E stands for, actually. I'm short on sleep. What's that? Engineering, that's right. So that's what those games are really, really focused on, right? And then SEL, does anyone have anything that they would like to add on SEL? Sabina?
So, we know the full forms of SEL and STEM. SEL is social emotional learning. So when we talk about STEM, it's more about the knowledge and skill part of a curriculum. And when we talk about SEL, then comes in the attitude. So along with the skill, I think we need to develop an attitude as well. So what we are trying to do, I'm going to talk about it later, is like when we design games, we consciously tried to bring in the SEL element. And especially when you're doing games, there's typically a story going around a particular game or a particular concept. So it's easy to actually, if you put in a little thought, it's actually easy to put in the SEL element into a STEM game also.
So there's an example of that, actually, building off of what you're saying. And it's a study by Val Shute from Florida State and Key, and I forgot the other author. Sorry. Anyway.
He's not here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good point. So anyway, her study had to do with the game Portal 2, which is a physics game, but not really. It's wrapped in story. And in the game Portal 2, which I still remember winning the entire game, I got really excited. You get a gun called a portal gun. Has anybody here played Portal 2? Anybody? Okay, cool. All right, we'll talk later. So anyway, you get a gun, right, but it doesn't kill anybody. You can shoot a blue hole in the wall or an orange hole in the wall. So if I shoot a blue hole here and an orange hole there, and I drop a water bottle here, it'll fall out of the ceiling there, right? So it teaches physics experientially. And it also, according to their study, taught physics much better. The results were much higher. I don't remember the exacts, but than a brain training game. In this case, it was Lumosity, right? And Lumosity was sued also at one point for making claims that you're playing these brain training games without any efficacy behind it. But part of it is also what's called transportation theory, which is when you are mentally transported into a fictional world. And that's very important too, to have that, you know, that delivery into the game system or the narrative, as you're saying.
Did anyone else want to say anything? Okay. So, STEM, hard science, is the core of the game. In SEL, it's all about sort of the soft sciences, the humanities, communicating with other people. And I think it's important to note that in some cases, it can be fictitious, right? You have a narrative there that you feel for characters in the world, and it's a fictitious kind of empathy that you're having. But there's also other paradigms, like in a massively multiplayer online game like World of Warcraft, there's other real people out there in the world that you are meeting and chatting with and coordinating your activities with and doing all kinds of like real world coordinated activities. And so it's not, World of Warcraft is not designed to say, oh, this is going to satisfy an SEL curriculum. But Sean from Classcraft looked at that paradigm from playing lots of WoW and came up with a way to gamify his classroom in a way that tied his students together coherently and gave them gamified roles drawn and inspired by World of Warcraft. So you've got fictitious, you have real world. These are things that can happen. And go ahead, Elliot.
Well, there's a sort of a new paradigm for teaching science called NGSS, Next Generation Science Standards. And it's all about not teaching the facts of science, but teaching the processes of science. And in the kinds of games that Chris is talking about, where you're working to do something which is more project-oriented, than getting across these notions of collecting data, of what is evidence, how do you use evidence. Those kinds of practices of science can be involved in those kinds of multiplayer games. And some of the students in the class then would be part of that game. So that's a very exciting opportunity, because Kathy and I work with folks that are trying to teach NGSS via paper and pencil. And I'll tell you, it is boring, and those kids hate it, right? And so here is a way to do it that it actually doesn't make a lot of demands on the computing resources, because that's really an issue in the schools that we're working with. Many of the kids have $40 tablets. They're the Amazon 7-inch tablets. They cost $40 US. I mean, they're pretty minimal, but they're enough to play those kinds of games where the kids can participate and learn the practices of science, not just the facts of science.
On a similar vein, the same thing happens in engineering, right? So engineering really is about trying something and then adapting your design and do that iteratively. Kerbal Space Program is a perfect example of an engineering game. My own studies were in engineering, and they did project-based learning for that first year. And I'm sure it would have saved them a lot of time if they included some games in there.
So there's one additional point here, too, that I want to bring up that we had discussed earlier, which is all these ideas that we're talking about STEM and SEL, they're not technology dependent. The different technologies that you use to create these games and to play these games will empower different kinds of activity, but you can have a very social game with cards, right? Or even, right? Like, that's your hand. There's nothing magic about that. So you can start off with like literally empty hands and have a game and engage people in play. And so don't feel gated by lack of technology. Whatever technology you have is sufficient if you choose to move forward. So don't feel blocked by that. All right, so we got hard science on this side. We got touchy-feely social stuff on this side. Oftentimes they're conceptualized as being, oh, well, this is a very serious game, it's very scientific. And then there's this other really touchy-feely experience, and I cried when I played this game. So what's the point of taking the chocolate and the peanut butter and jamming it together into one game experience? Like, how is that, doesn't that just confuse the player? It's like, I don't know what to think, I'm supposed to be logical, but now I'm being emotional. What do I do? Okay, so with that set up, I've got Sabina's slides ready to go, and she has experience in kind of beginning the discussion on that. There you go.
So just to answer the question that Chris put up, I mean, we don't live our life in compartments. If we have a problem, we don't say it's a maths problem or physics problem. Suppose you have an electrical fire in the house. So you would apply science to extinguish that fire. You would apply your social emotional skills to save your pet, your child, your parents, your house. So then why should learning be in compartments? I mean, it should be blended so that it's more holistic and more real in nature. So I've already talked about like what we do. So we have created around 400 games which are mapped to maths and EVS, mapped to the Indian curriculum. And the conscious decision has been to integrate the SCL into these science and maths games. When we talk about SCL, there are actually two aspects to it. One is the actual content part, like creating the content which has elements of SCL blended into it. And it's also the implementation. So when you take games to schools, typically it's very rare that there would be individualized learning, especially in the Indian context, and there would be a lot of group learning that happens. And there's a huge chunk of focus on SCL skills when you actually talk about group learning. So I'm going to show two videos which are just evidences of what I'm talking about. The first one is about a classroom scenario. That was the first day when they were introduced to our games. Children were not comfortable with computers. They had never seen our games. You'll see the video and you see there's no teacher, there's no adult, how they manage among themselves, how they help each other, which is a good evidence of how SCL was built in. So you'll notice this young child, he acts as a leader and tries to bring in some decorum in the class. So what you see is they learn to manage their time. They learn to take turns, they learn to be patient with each other. One of them becomes a leader in most of the cases. They help each other. Those who are not very good with concepts, they are being helped by their peers. So that's a very, very good way of building these skills. And this one is actually the evidence of a game where we have tried to have hardcore math concepts, and how this one talks about keeping the city clean and beautifying it. So just because of paucity of time, it's been converted into a video, but it's actually a game. So this is actually talking about geometry and mensuration. So talking about area, perimeter, and the idea is to keep the city, beautify the city. This is another game. This is on data handling, where we are talking about how tigers are becoming extinct and the need for saving tigers. We talk about the tiger reserves that are in India, and we build in different concepts of how much budget needs to be allocated. So apart from data handling, we are also providing the infraction skills in this, about money management, apart from SCL. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a pretty eloquent answer to the question of whether we should combine these things two together, right? Because technology doesn't exist for itself. It exists. It's a tool for us to use for purposes. And our purposes are often directed by our social emotional goals for saving the tiger or these other kinds of things. And there's definitely hard science behind those kinds of goals. But there's also a sense of contribution and progress and being part of society that's a big part of that. So let's go back to this then again and open it up or have a panel discussion to talk about putting these together. Anyone have an opinion on this?
Well, we've been working in second grade and third grade, fourth grade in Dallas, Texas, and actually, why don't you talk about this with the kids and their collaboration? Okay. We find that the kids don't know how to collaborate. When we get them to work together, they talk at each other. They don't work together. They don't know how to collaborate. And we think it's just kind of, well, just work together, just work together. No, they don't know what that even means. And when they're out in the playground, they might be able to collaborate, but when they're doing work like calculate perimeter or something like that, they have no idea. And it actually was very disconcerting to us, thinking, well, somebody's got to teach these kids how to talk to each other. Just talk to each other. And you think maybe they would get it at home, maybe they would get it at school. They're not getting it. And so how are we going to help kids learn? And this is not an isolated case. These are schools that are 99% free, and these are poor kids. They come to school at 7 o'clock in the morning, they get a carton of milk, and they get a sandwich. That's breakfast. Then they have lunch at school, so at least they have 2 meals. So, and I'm sure in India we have the same sorts of problems. But how are you going to get these children to learn how to collaborate?
To add to that point, when we try our games in schools, right, the main thing that I keep seeing is mostly competition between the kids rather than collaboration, right? So they're really happy to talk to each other, to tell them they're better than the other one, right? Like that's something they want to do. And so I don't know yet how we could account for that in terms of the game design in order to encourage more collaboration, right? Like we can think of different ways to reward that. We can think of an MMO that kind of helps somehow doing this, but this is very much an open question for me, is how could we kind of move to the next step of how we use these games, how kids use these games in a way that's probably more empathic, right? Than
absolutely.
it currently is.
Yeah.
So,
I'm a former classroom teacher, but I was a history teacher, not a science, technology, engineering, or math teacher. Full disclosure. But I would have my students play single-player games together because they would have that, not just the collaboration, but what's missing, I feel, in the conversation, often in games, is what's known as the metagame, which is the conversation that goes around the game. This is what we see gamers do. They go on wikis, they go on Twitch and YouTube and watch streaming. They talk about games, and what the experience was like. And that is actually known as, reflective practice. So it's not just a screen transmitting information at the student. It's also not just games because games are engaging. I hear that a lot too. Or flow, like flow theory, when you are at your, you are at your
Optimal challenge.
optimal challenge. Well, you know what is a flow theory if you read Mahai Csikszentmihalyi, which I think I pronounced right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is yoga. Gardening is flow theory. When I walk my dog, I think of all sorts of creative things. I'm in the state of flow. I'm not getting badges. I got 3 stars for walking my dog. My son plays Minecraft like a lot of kids do, right? And he just loves it. He's in a state of flow. He's not getting badges every time he builds something. And you know what happened around the metagame? He watches YouTube videos. He develops his vocabulary around that. He understands how electronics work because he's used Redstone, which is like electronic circuit blocks. And on his birthday, the school where he goes, every kid gets a free book on their birthday. The book he got was on perimeter and area because he wanted to learn the mathematics behind it.
Very unusual sons.
We have a very unusual house.
That I can believe.
We have a game-rich household.
There was a couple of points here. Number one, Anantha, on the keynote address, dropped the mic when he said, our schools are creating predators and they should be creating nurturers. And I think that that's a big part of why we would want to combine these things together, because the social emotional side of things gives us empathy and allows us to not try to get ahead by, reaching up and pulling other people down, but by collaborating and moving forward. All of us adults in the world work using STEM ideas, but we're doing it as part of a team. Almost nobody is sitting by themselves doing their own little thing. We're all working with other people, and that's just a skill set that has to be nurtured. And to see kids coming in and they don't have that, the purpose of education is, this is my definition, purpose of education is to prepare kids for being a meaningful member of society and participating in, that means working and just getting along with other people. And so that's such a big part of it. So you need to know more than science. You need to know how to get along. And so I think there's a compelling reason why we would want to have these game experiences combined so that it's not some weird foreign thing when you experience the real world, and these two things are not separate, that the real world is a combined experience, and we should deliver games that have that. That sound about a good wrap-up of where we are at this? Okay, we got a few phases in this discussion, so we'll move on to the next one. All right. So we've seen some examples of what people have been putting together. We all have experience making games and making experiences and watching kids. So we thought we would just kind of have a more open panel discussion right now about our experiences, best practices. There's some of it has already bubbled up. And let me just open the discussion to that. So we got 2 big questions here: best practices and ideas for blended games. Like, how would we take a game that's out there that's one or the other and kind of add these other components together?
What do you mean by blended game?
So that has STEM plus SCL. Yeah.
Should I go?
Please go.
So again, I don't know if it's a best practice. We're just going to talk about my experience. So in India, when we talk about science for lower grades, we have environmental science, which as a curriculum itself focuses a lot on social emotional learning. Like, there are topics on water conservation, water pollution, air pollution, using renewable energy, then protecting animals, plants, and the world around us. So that's easy to do. When it comes to actually hardcore mathematics or any other language for that matter, then it may be a little tough, but there could be a few small things, like that's what we did, but we can do a lot. We can try and break gender stereotypes, right? Like, if we create a storyboard, we have a game on math, data handling, where we have to sort letters and create a table out of it. So we are showing a postmaster there, but it's a female postmaster. So typically when you talk about a postmaster, only a man would come into your mind. So we consciously try to break that stereotype and created that character. Then another example is like we talk about family in EVS. So there's a child who's talking about his parents, grandparents, sibling. And there we say that my mother is an electrician and my father is a teacher. And my father takes me to school every day. So that's another way of breaking the standards or the stereotypes. Apart from that, like the games that I showed, like we can talk about protecting the world around us, and there could be several games that can be built around it. Building empathy, having characters which have different abilities. I mean, they could be a paraplegic character doing something. Why have like characters having all features? So those are some of the things that we can take care and try and build.
Francois, let me just jump in here real quick. So I think that you bring up a really interesting notion here that social doesn't just mean interplay between people, it's society,
Yeah.
and you have these social constructs of these stereotypes of like, oh, this role is always male or this role is always female. And so this is something that's literally free to do when you're designing games and you're putting these things together. Just be conscious of these assumptions that you have, and as a student encounters that and says, wow, that's different from what my expectation was, now that's been broken a little bit and they've opened up their mind a little bit, and it's just there in the game experience, and it was just as easy for the game developer to do it one way or the other. So that's a real easy way to be socially aware and make the game a little more SEL. Go ahead, Francois. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. And actually, to also piggyback on what you just said, my initial kind of reaction to how we could blend STEM and SEL is that the way that we do STEM is mostly on the game mechanic side of things, right? What you actually do in the game. But we also have a story in our games, right? We have a story of a little mammoth that wants to cross the screen because he heard at some point, like maybe a female mammoth, you're not quite sure, maybe a baby mammoth, and he just wants to investigate. And so we have all of that blended within the game right now, right? And we do that for just holding the interest, and you want to know as a player what's going on with that little mammoth. But that story could very well be designed for another type of impact, and it wasn't done that way, right? Like it was just done to hold the interest, but it could very much be also integrating ideas on how to build empathy, or best practices that you talked about a little bit earlier about some games that had a storyline that really brought something to the players, right? And so that was my initial kind of reaction to how we could blend the two. We also touched on something just before, which is how players use the game, and that I have no idea how to actually fix, right? But there's probably something to do there as well. So if you guys have ideas on this, yeah.
And to circle back on a lot of this, another missing piece that I always like to emphasize lately a lot is this idea of children making games. This goes back to Seymour Papert and his work on constructionism. If a child is making a math game or a science game, but in particular, Papert wrote about math games, just the act of constructing a personally meaningful artifact, if it's digital or tangible. This is a quote from Yasmin Kafai, who was just at lunch with us. So I don't know where she is now, but she has a really good book on this called Connected Gaming. And the idea is you play a game, and then you have an opportunity to reflect and then make a game. Now, we see this all over. This is Minecraft, survival mode, creative mode. Scratch, coding is like this too. You can play and then you can make. And this piece I see in the intersection of really good teaching, where if it's not there up front in a game or platform where there's like a level editor to add to it, you can just do it yourself. You could take index cards and Sharpies or Post-its, Children want to make games of all ages once they play a game. It doesn't have to be a finished game. And that is where the learning happens. That's how we learn through projects. That's where it goes from game-based learning to project-based learning. That's where deeper learning exists.
Elliot and I had an experience when we were working with undergraduate students, and what I noticed was the difference in the types of games that the male and the female students wanted to create. The males tended to want to do things like what was the name of the game with the math? Oh, it was Math Blasters, where they were shooting the answers out of the sky when they were solving mathematical problems. When the females were designing games for mobile devices, and they wanted a game like that where the answer was a mathematical answer was you had to find it someplace. They chose the name Bubble. It was like Bubble Blaster, where all they would do is burst a bubble with a pin, as opposed to using a gun. They were opposed to the violence of the gun and preferred just to burst a bubble to come up with the answer.
There's a book about this, actually, and I forgot the full name. It has to do with Atari. It's from MIT Press, and it's a whole history of games. And actually, some of it is rooted in culture of, the boy will grow up and defend the house. And we've saw lots of games like that, Galaga, Space Invaders, Missile Command, until Pac-Man. Pac-Man was the game that really brought more females into gaming, right? And then it just pushed the other way. We see this a lot, like in the 1990s, Myst is a game where you can just point around the screen, and then Doom came out at the same time, where you're just shooting in hallways, and that really took over the conversation. There's lots of games out there. We talk about Fortnite a lot. I can't get my son to play Fortnite. I've asked him. He wants to play Minecraft, right? Which is another, gender neutral game. I think there's a lot of interesting experiences out there, both culturally and as you were saying, as students decide or self-select what to make.
Do we know of a good game that actually blends STEM and SEL right now, or because I'm trying to come up with examples. Yeah. No.
So there's something that was occurring to me. I'm going to try to go back up here to where we saw Kerbal Space Program right here.
But that's because of the way we integrate it in the classroom, right?
So so Kerbal is really a very hard science STEM-y kind of a game. But then they did this fun little SEL side of things. They have the actual Kerbals themselves are these goofy little creatures that you're trying to put into space. And so this could have just been this very dry space. I'm going to build a rocket and send it up and it will explode 9 times out of 10. But now there's stuff going on here, right? Like there's a giant robot is grabbing it, and I've got like these goofy little characters. They added this kind of fun factor to it. So now there's a narrative and a story that's emerging through your successes and failures. It's like, oh man, I blew up that little dude, right? Now there's some meaning that you can sort of attach to this otherwise abstract science activity. And so knowing that you're trying to rescue these little guys is not hard to put in, but it adds this extra dimension to the experience that takes it from being this really dry, as bread that's been left out overnight experience, and adding butter and jam to it and making it a fun experience.
They also added a nice touch, I thought, for Kerbal Space Program, where the Kerbals, I think they're called Kerbals in the game, but they can have properties, right? And one of the properties sometimes is just panic in space, or not really easy being in space, and that's the whole point of the game. And so it just feels kind of they want to get on, but then they have also reactions to different situations they can be in, right? And I don't know, I felt guilty about sending a Kerbal in space that didn't want to be there, so yeah, thought it was interesting.
Can I ask a question of the designers? We're working in schools, and they play games. There's one called iStation. I don't know if you know the game. And the kids love it. They just love it. And what we've seen is when the kids are challenged with a problem, and they don't want to do that problem, they'll play iStation. And it's very comforting. A mathematical problem they don't want to deal with. They don't want to deal with it. Can we play iStation? Can we play iStation? And so there's something about that game that really it makes them feel good. So as you guys as designers, How hard is it to get the SEL into a game and something that would challenge these children, because all they do is they play it over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, so that has been a constant challenge because you have to really balance the learning part of it and the gamification part of it. If you make a game too simple and add too much of learning element into it, then kids just shun it away. And if you add too much gaming element, then teachers would call it crappy. So that's a fine balance that you have to find. And as you go higher up on the grades, the challenge becomes more. And actually what we did, I mean, like you were talking about war games and all, so you can see a trajectory. As we started creating games for grade 7 and 8, we actually started introducing games where you have to shoot a missile or create a plane and shoot down enemy tanks and all, because we wanted to bring in that engagement. And we knew kids of that age will not be too excited about cleaning up cities and saving tigers.
So I think you bring up a really good point here, which is it's not about the games, it's not about the students, it's about the teacher's attitude towards having these kinds of things, right? When you have a great work of literature or a wonderful award-winning movie, you don't discount it because it has all this emotional stuff. That's kind of the value proposition there. Or if you have a wonderful documentary that shows some human condition, but it's also really like it's very factual and it's doing these things, right? It's blending kind of the factual with the social emotional. So teachers, please carry the message out into the school systems that this is a good thing when a game experience has this going on. If you see your students engaging in an emotional way, that's good. If they're talking about the experience afterwards and they're sharing their knowledge and they're sharing all those other kinds of things, that's what you want to have happen, not have them be traumatized by the learning experience and just go sit silently in a corner after you're done injecting them with teaching. Go ahead, Matt.
So one other thing I'd like to talk about before it slips my mind is that part of the CASTLE framework, social emotional learning, is this notion of being ethical decision makers, right? And if we look where we have Silicon Valley in the United States right now, there's talk about ethics because let's make another app. Let's make another app. This will do this. This will be the Uber of this, the Netflix of this, without any thought about consequences. I listened to an interesting talk by an author, Stephen Johnson, recently, and he talked about something called a pre-mortem, which is a thought experiment, and it's a terrific thing to do with students. And it actually doesn't even involve a game, right? So a post-mortem, which is Latin for after death, that's what you do after you have a technology, you produce a Pixar cartoon, you do some sort of event like the Tech 2018 conference, and we talk about what went right, what went wrong, how can we iterate and improve next year. A pre-mortem, this comes from medicine. So a doctor might look at a patient like Chris over here and say, well, what's the worst thing that could happen to Chris if he keeps eating like all this Indian food? Right? What's the worst that could happen? Let's work our way backwards, right? What if Facebook started by saying, what would happen in 10 years? What's the worst thing that will happen? Oh, I don't know, maybe Russians might try to hack our elections, allegedly, right? Well, can we work our way backwards to make sure that our technology doesn't do that, right? And these are parts of ethics we want in youth because the youth will be running the technology businesses and businesses in general in the future. So we need them to be thoughtful, and I think these thought exercises, such as pre-mortems, are super useful.
Okay, well, we are at the point where we should be shifting over to Q&A. We've talked a lot ourselves. Okay, so let's go here. All right, Q&A. Do we have someone who's going to walk around with a microphone? Okay. No, we got the mic coming.
Instead of a cube, we could just throw the mic.
Yeah. So, okay, please pay attention to the best practices.
The cube's
so
over there.
have your question ready to go and make it, just ask the question, please. And then speak clearly because everyone else needs to hear your question too. So you got the mic, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm struggling with one aspect here. STEM curriculum in general is well thought out, right? People have worked for centuries, put some structure together. They're there in textbooks, and teachers can pick those textbooks and teach. And then you translate that into technology. You build an app or you build a game. Arguably, it's relatively easier to translate. But when you're talking about socio, emotional, economic, whatever, that learning, it's, first of all, we ourselves don't have a good grasp of it. The moment you try to translate that into a game or technology, the bias that you are carrying as an individual who is designing the game will most likely creep into it, right? Let's say an American designed it and you launch that in India. That will have that Netflix effect of all American content kind of reaching to every part of India and creating unknown side effects, right? So that the individual biases we carry, because there is no pedagogy, there is no structured thinking, would then creep into games, etc. I'm generally, as you guys are speaking about this concept, I'm struggling to understand how can we even translate something into technology when we ourselves don't know how to teach it to begin with.
Great question. So, the question was, how can we translate these intangibles really into technology when we're already just having a hard time speaking about it and teaching it straight up? Anybody? There you go.
It goes back to what I said to begin with. If we as designers and educators cannot combine or create a curriculum with the games, with the SEL embedded already for you, it cannot happen. The expectation cannot be that you as a teacher will design the game and the SEL and the STEM all together. That's not your job description. It's up to the educational community and the game designers to do that for you, to provide you with the tools that you need to be able to do those things. It's unrealistic.
Yeah, I'll just add, technology is actually not the end here. It's just a means to bring a standard way of teaching and learning across a wide scale. So it's not right to say that there's no pedagogy involved with it. It actually starts with that. You start with the curriculum, you start with a certain pedagogy, you engage with the experts in that field, and then you just bring in the story element, which you would do in a textbook also. So when you write a textbook, that also is written by certain educators and graphic designers and writers and whatnot. So as you mentioned, biases can creep in, but just the way you need to take care when you write a textbook, you need to do the same for games as well.
And maybe to add to that, there is a potential for games to offer more on the side of SEL, but it's very much important to think about it, right? So I agree with you. It's going to be hard to define initially, right? But I think as we have more examples of games that sometimes succeed in most countries of the world, for example, right? Like we can then study that. So having the conversation early, I think, will be useful. I agree, though, it's going to be a long journey and a challenge. I don't even think we're there yet for STEM games in general. So SEL games will be probably take twice as long to do. Right.
Yep. So, just real quick, digital games were invented by engineers. So the trend towards STEM was like built in from the beginning. But if you take a look back all the way at the beginning with Pac-Man is not just a dot moving around hitting other dots. It's like a little guy, and there's ghosts, and there's food, right? So there's like stuff going on there in terms of storytelling that's happening there. It's really super basic, but there's a reason why, even at that early level where it's just pure technology, you still have a level of this sort of storytelling kinds of humanizing it and putting it in some sort of context. So, He's got the mic, so he gets to talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
For me, it's not a question of discussion that STEM and social emotional learning, they should go together. And it's like this division between social sciences and hard sciences. Usually it sounds really artificial. Like if you want to know science deep enough, you should go into philosophy. So why do we keep using at all abbreviature STEM? Maybe you should just abandon it. Why do we need it at all? What's your position on it?
Panel?
Well, you know, I think the exciting thing about STEM when it was really starting to take hold, and I remember going with my middle school at the time because we were setting up taking out the old shop lab, wood shop, and turning it into a STEM lab. Crazy, right? So, yeah, I mean, the whole concept is supposed to be interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary. So you're not just teaching math not connected to anything or science not connected to anything. Sometimes we see, you know, STEM delivered like recipes, like do all these things and this is the outcome. You know, it's not open-ended enough. I like STEAM where there's the art aspect to it. I'm not as much proponent of just saying multimodal. I like the idea that it's interest-powered and children bring their own interests. If they self-select themselves as an artist or as a scientist or a mathematician, they bring their own set of skills to that.
Okay, so I think really, but the question I think was like, why should we have these things as separate things? Why don't we just abolish it and just say, oh, there's this whole big experience? And you use the word recipe, right? So if I'm planning a dinner party, that's great. That's like this big thing. But there's a portion of that where I want a recipe so I can prepare a dish, and that's very STEMmy, right? Like it's very straightforward. So if I'm talking about making a thing and baking something, I want that recipe. I want it really STEMmy. And then there's other parts where I have this bigger thing, and depending on what we're talking about, I think there's a value to having it just be this focused, tightly focused thing, and then there's another value to have this broader experience, this richer.
Well, when we talk about games, we talk about why. Like, why are we using games? We're using games because games are systems, and when we learn games, we learn how those systems interconnect and how those interconnections have other interconnections and so on, right? So I think if to continue with the food analogy, let's think about cooking and not baking, right? So in baking, you have to put on all the ingredients and know them in advance so the bread rises, right? But in cooking, you're making a soup. You could add a little more salt, pepper. You know, you can hack and mod the system, right? So I think that's important too. You don't want to give a child, you know, a blank slate, right? It's too intimidating.
Yep. Everything in it, I mean, there's a place for all these different pieces. We've got room for like 2 more questions. I'm sorry, but we're kind of at the end of the hour. Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Venkat. I'm from a foundation called Anadi Foundation. I've done my dissertation PhD in computer science in a topic called learning by doing. So currently we are working in using virtual reality to teach mathematics and physics to kids. Like the kids will build the world. And while building, they have to learn the concept of mathematics and physics. It's quite a niche stage, but still we find encouraging results. This question is especially to the SEL team. Now, for example, in this context, the project has elements of STEM. How do we bring the elements of SEL to this? I saw some of the demo that you showed now, which is good. But when they are going to build the world, that itself is quite complex for the cognitive ability the kid has. And if you are going to bring the elements of SEL in parallel to this, how much they will be able to get in is a question that we have to consider. And how can we optimally blend them together? So what are the best practices that we can have?
So it's a really good question because I'm not quite sure how to do it myself, right? So I don't know if you had the beginning of an answer, but things we just talked about here is like sometimes in the story, right? Like you can be careful about at least not having stereotypes in there, that kind of stuff. We didn't touch on that, but what I noticed in the playtest at least is if you want your kids to be in a state of mind that is very much open to problem resolution as well, right? And I don't know how much this is SEL or anything, but I did notice that whenever we add time pressure, for example, in the games, it does throw off a segment of the population playing it. For some reason, in my experience, it was mostly girls that were not at ease with the time pressure, right? I don't know if it's the same everywhere. But so there's a few design tricks you can do at least on that side, but I don't know that it's actual SEL content in there, right? So I struggle to answer that question myself for my own games.
Well, so I've been doing this quite a bit to kind of add that in there, so I can throw out a few things, right? Like, so adding some sort of narrative to the game experience, right? To sort of have something that the player can relate to there that resonates with the real world, especially if it has something to do with other human beings, right? I mean, it's right there in the social and the emotional. So just think about what is social, what is emotional, and just start kind of putting those in there, right? So to add a story, like in math, we call those word problems, right? Like, oh, there's a car traveling from here. That's still pretty abstract. If it's my car and I have a whole journey that I'm taking because I need to take my mom across country to visit her mom, right? Like, now I have a story and I'm still doing the math problems to get me there, but I have this context and I got my mom who's like, in between math problems, maybe she's complaining to me about the fact I'm not going fast enough. So, it's just, you could just kind of do these things and contextualize them and make them, or make it multiplayer and have other people. You have to coordinate with your mom to drive the car. God help you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's not impossible at all. I mean, be it any subject, because we've dealt with a lot of subjects. So it depends on the kind of content that you have, but you can build in elements like what they've mentioned. The starting point could be the characters that you build in, right? Show diversity in characters. Don't show them as perfect. If you're showing them as adults, don't show them as like a beautiful woman or a handsome young man. Show them as regular people you would see in a day-to-day life. It could be the starting point, and as like we've all discussed, there could be several things that can be added.
So real quick, just to kind of to touch on that, what I was talking about before is this sort of narrative string, right? Like there's this big story. You also have this notion of environmental storytelling. Just by having things present in the game space, you're telling the player a story. So by changing the characters up, breaking the stereotypes, creating a scenario that's just there, you don't even have to say anything. It's just present, and it's making a statement on these vectors of social emotional learning. So we got room for one more question.
Here.
Who's got the microphone?
I do.
Vijaya, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. That was a great session. My question is for both of you, if you can answer. I mean, social emotional learning is reflected only through practical experiences, socializing in social life. So when you are creating a game, you have score. Children have to score on that, on the game. So my question is that, do you have an applicative part in your games so that they have to score it by doing something manually? And if they have to upload the photograph or video, whatever they have done. For example, whatever you have said in City, what's that game? Smart City? City Corporation, okay. So in that City Corporation, if they are playing the game, do you apply something manual work, manual assignments like things, that you plant a tree, you just go, see how it grows and just put it, upload the things. If you can combine blending of a manual as well as the gaming into, the social emotional learning will be more easy.
Absolutely.
In my aspect.
That's a brilliant idea.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't have it, but yeah. I mean, that's something that we can actually think when we design new games, and what you said, like you get additional 50 points or 100 points. And to add to it, the other aspect is that you create leaderboards and other things. So you compare yourself with other children and see how they're doing. And there we could add skill parameters, the SEL parameters as well, which children compare and see where they stand.
Do you have some games like that by now?
Nothing which have what you're suggesting, like you upload something and do something physically, and then we add it in our game, and so we don't have it, unfortunately, but I will keep it in mind.
I hope we will have it next tech. But thank you.
So I think there's a need to be able to go out and research, just look for SEL games and see what's out there and draw inspiration from those things. Okay, so I just want to say our time is done officially. There are other sessions starting in the Coral with the breakout sessions going over there, and they're going to be starting up now. So if you have another session that you want to go to, please feel free. There's no obligation for you to stay. But there are people who have more questions, so we're going to keep doing more Q&A. Are you good with that? Okay, so we're going to keep doing more Q&A, and we'll try to answer some of those. We'll keep that going for a little bit more.
Thank you for taking my question. So there are a few SEL competencies.
Oh, there she is. Okay.
I'm right here. So there are a few SEL skills that were mentioned during the conversation today. Communication, empathy, working in groups. My understanding of developing SEL skills in a child or in a person is then a change in behavior in how one communicates, how one works in a team, or how one reacts after feeling the emotion of empathy. So not just feeling empathetic because the tigers are dying, but like what is the action after that? So my question is, to what degree are STEM games being able to integrate this behavior change in the SEL skill of the child, and how is it being measured? Because it's not about feeling empathy, but it's an action that results from that. Because today I can feel empathy and do nothing. A few years later, I will feel empathy and actually act. And are we able to track that behavior change?
Yeah, so this is exactly what this lady also suggested, that, attitude is something that is very difficult to measure, and how do you see that whether a game has actually built that attitude? It depends on what action they do on the ground. So that is what she suggested, that maybe you add elements where they do something in real life and then that gets added as a point to the game. But let me point out to the games that we showed, they're inherently STEM games. So SEL is just a underlying thing that goes in that. So that's not the core aim over here. Core aim is still learning data handling. So we try and measure that. However, we have few games, like we have games on water sanitation and hygiene, right? So there we focus a lot on SEL and attitude changes.
And then I stopped doing it, versus a few days from now, I failed, and I kept failing until I succeeded. That's the inherent SEL skill of perseverance. Whether it's a tiger story or whether it's a math problem, it's the skill of perseverance.
Yeah.
I feel like we're conflating the definition of SEL.
So that's where how you design the games, how you design the whole environment. It should not cause a sense of failure for the child. It should encourage the child to try again. And also in the kind of setting they are implemented, right? If they are in a school setting where children are learning in groups, so they keep trying, they help each other, they ensure that till the time they get the concept right, they keep trying. So those are elements that you build in. SEL is not something that you can measure by just putting a few questions in a game and measure it, right? It's more qualitative in nature. So, there could be elements that you build in a game, but then the human intervention doesn't go away when you have to measure SEL.
Well, and I just want to add on to that, right? Like your question touches on the difference between hard science. This is the eternal kind of dynamic between hard science, which is really measurable and objectively measurable, and these soft skill sets, which are very, very difficult to measure, and which is, I think, why SEL is just now coming forward as, oh man, they're sort of invisibly lurking there all the time, and it's like there was a question earlier. It's like, how do we even put these things in when we don't know how to teach about this stuff? And then the question is, well, how do I know that I'm effectively teaching it? What are these objective metrics that I could be capturing as part of gameplay that would tell me that we're succeeding at making someone more empathic? That's a heck of a question, right? Like that's hard, and I don't know that you have clear data. You could certainly look at patterns of play and try to reach some sort of educated conclusion, but I don't know what degree of confidence you would have in that. And it's hard. And, games are not a silver bullet. They don't exist as like, okay, we don't need the classroom anymore. We're just going to have a game, right? Like a game is part of the totality of experience. So to have a classroom discussion afterwards, how did that make you feel? Like I noticed that you scored a point on this other guy. Like there's that notion of having a conversation. The teacher is still present. There needs to be that human, like humans can assess other humans better than machines can assess humans for this kind of a thing. And that's where we are right now. So, it just needs to be integrated into a bigger pedagogical approach. It's not the everything, it's part of it. But it can be very effective because it's engaging and it will make people jump into it. Yeah. So was there any more? Are we done? All right. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. We have one more. Okay, and then that's it. Go ahead.
I have been waiting for the beginning. My name is, I'm Anis. I'm from Azim Premji University, Bangalore.
And what's your question, Anthony?
My question is, the emotions, the children acquires the emotional development through the human emotions. So what I feel is the child acquires emotions from the teacher or the peers he or she lives in. So the machine cannot give the emotional development. That's my thought. And the second thing is the child is always looking at a 2D screen, a LED screen or VR equipment. So doesn't there a kind of artificiality that the child knows that the child is not involved in 100%, that the child knows that something is on my face or something is in front of me, it's not reality. So doesn't that matters?
Yeah, it matters. So, I think that the question was like, so how can technology assess humans' emotions, and also the fact that this is a artificial presentation that's not real changes the experience, right? So to answer the first one, generally speaking, so we're breaking new ground by being able to assess emotional content, like emotional player responses. Right across the hall is a headset that's actually looking at the emotional state of the player and is changing the game environment to de-stress things or make them more exciting, depending on the emotional state of the player. So that's a first step. It's literally reading their mind. And then with Kai, in the text blocks and in audio inputs that the students are able to do as part of like a journal entry, Sarab is developing an AI that will go in and analyze the emotional content of the vocabulary that's being used by the students and deliver an analysis of some of emotionalness of what they wrote. And they can tell, are they feeling sad? Are they being angry? Are they bored? And then we have the A, is Devesh. And we'll be able to potentially do something with that when we know that, oh, this student feels this way. So it's not widely out there, but in this conference, there's 2 different technologies that are looking at player emotions to do things with that. So you're here right now as that question is being answered, which is very exciting.
Yeah. And there's a flip side to it. Like you're talking about experiences in real life. Sometimes they cannot experience everything. For example, I'll give you a case where there's a part of the curriculum where they try to teach the forts of India. Now, not every child in India has the privilege of visiting a fort. So games then bring you that kind of an experience where they can see on a screen how forts are built, why they are built that way. Right? So there are always 2 sides of the coin, and there's always need to balance. So nobody is saying that you do away with human intervention. It is required, but games and technology bring in a certain kind of standardization and good quality for a huge number of children. Some of them may not have access to otherwise.
Yep. And, kids have little stuffed animals that they become very, very attached to. They imagine, right? We have this imagination, so we can take artificial things and imagine that they're real. And so that's part of the whole thing, right? And it's not real, but at the same time, you can pretend and you suspend disbelief, and that works. Okay, so I think that wraps up our session. Thank you for anybody who's still here.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. We have a whole new audience. Okay, thanks. This is done? Okay, great. Thanks, man.